You're listening to the Youth for Life podcast with Michelle Bauman, Director of Y4Life at Lutherans for Life, where we prepare youth to be gospel-motivated voices for life. Be sure to stick around after today's live recording of our Chats for Life program to find out how you can be live too on our next Youth for Life podcast.
So first of all, obviously, when we talk about creation versus evolution, we want to talk about how God's design is purposeful. And certainly we don't buy into all of evolutionary theory. So what I had here actually was this, and you guys can do this. So I have this paper bag, yeah? And you're gonna tell me what you think is in it, okay? So can you tell me, just based on the paper bag, what's inside? No, right?
It's small. I would know
yeah.
that.
Good. So you can deduce it's small. What other sensory things could you do to find out what's inside of the paper bag?
You could shake it for us.
Yeah, I could shake it for you. So what can you tell from shaking it?
It's probably your keys.
You think it's something that makes noise and can bounce, right?
Yeah,
so you think keys, okay. You can see that it like makes the bottom of the bag kind of dip, right? So it's a little bit, it's heavy, kind of. And is it one thing or multiple things?
Multiple
things, right? You can hear, okay. So other senses, so we can hear, we obviously can see. What else could we do? We could smell it, right? Or we could reach in and feel it. Okay, so I'm going to tell you that I can hold it in the palm of my hand. I'll even show you what it is.
Like a marble or something.
Okay, could be a marble. What else could it be? So we've heard it, we've seen it. What could I do? What other senses? I could smell it and taste it, right? I'm not going to taste it because I can't eat this.
You want me to come eat it?
No, I can tell you what it tastes like. It tastes like chocolate.
Okay. Yeah.
So now that you know this, what is this? I'll flip it. Does that make a difference?
Is it an M&M?
It is. It's an M&M. Okay, so we used our senses, right, as much as we could via our online version, right, to figure out what it was. We created a hypothesis and we would have done the tests and those sorts of things. So let me just show you what we did is we looked at the scientific method, right? We observed, we then questioned what was it. We created a hypothesis. One of you said a marble, one of you said keys, right? And then we tested it. We did some experiments and we used our senses to do those experiments. And we were able to come to a conclusion. If I had eaten it, I would have confirmed that it was an M&M, okay? So there are two types of science. One is empirical science and one is historical science. And when we're looking at creation, well, empirical science, let's start there, is observable, it's testable, it's repeatable, you can form conclusions, and it's falsifiable. In other words, we can prove something wrong. We can make tests that will prove that it's not a marble, right? Or that it's not a Skittle, or that it's not something else. And so that good science is usually empirical science. When we think of science, we think of empirical science. But sometimes we're not there and we can't do those tests. And so what we try to do is what's called historical science. And historical science takes a view at the evidence that's presented to us, and it works backwards. It deducts past occurrences. It makes assumptions. It makes premises, and then does as much testing as is possible to prove that historical science might be true. So when we talk about creation, when we talk about evolution, are we talking about empirical science or are we talking about historical science? Historical science, right? Okay. We're trying to deduce past occurrences, and those occurrences are going to be, or those deductions are going to be inherently biased. Because whenever we look at historical science, we have to look through a lens. And so we're either going to be looking through a lens from a Christian perspective, or we're going to look through a lens from an evolutionary perspective. And that lens will shape how we read the evidence in front of us. And that's what's called an underlying supportive paradigm. Okay, so a paradigm is that lens we look through. So you can see empirical science in things like the creation of vaccines, in rocket science, right? Molecular biology. That's empirical science. But when we talk about creation versus evolution, we're really looking at historical science. And again, theists are people who believe that God created the world. And non-theists, which say, no, God didn't have anything to do with it, it's all scientific, will come up with different knowledge. Now, you need to know that science in general, the term science used to mean knowledge, okay? It used to mean the acquisition of knowledge. Now, most scientists will define science as not just the acquisition of knowledge, but specifically the acquisition of knowledge based on natural phenomenon, okay? And by nature then, or by that definition, today's science is going to steer away from looking at the possibility of what we call intelligent design. Have you guys heard of the term intelligent design? Just stick your hands up if you have. Yeah. Okay, so you've heard of intelligent design, but again, most scientists today won't even start to look at that or many scientists, because it does not focus purely on the natural order of things, okay? So let's take a look at some evolutionary claims. First of all, the first claim is that the Earth was once a materialistic vacuum. And we know as theists and as people that are engaged in intelligent design, or might believe in intelligent design, that surely the Earth was not always this way. And there's some evidence of that. Now, if you look at Genesis 1, you can see that there was a void, there was a nothingness. And to describe it as a materialistic vacuum might be appropriate, okay, depending on how they're explaining it. The next theory or next step then is that random particles collided and an explosion occurred 13.8 billion years ago. Now you should know, I was in high school, eons ago, actually not really, just a little over 20 years ago. And when I was in high school, they weren't saying 13.8 billion years. They were saying millions of years ago. Okay, so we have to recognize that the time frame, when we look purely from a non-theistic viewpoint, has changed. And they have realized that actually millions of years wasn't long enough for the things that they claim to have happened to have actually happened. So billions of years has now become the kind of the go-to. So that's just, again, another fact that should make us go, and when we think about humanness and fallacies and our condition, that kind of matches the theistic idea that maybe there is a higher power that has a mind that is unfathomable, okay? We also need to recognize that if indeed the world is really that old, and if indeed water even was billions of years ago, like the oceans were billions of years ago, if we look at the rate of evaporation today, our oceans would no longer exist. They would be just salt mines, basically. Okay, so again, if the Earth is really that old, there's actually some observable science that we can use that would say, I don't think so. Either that or something major has changed, okay? So then the next premises is that just over 4 billion years ago, the Earth appeared, again, billions, and over that time, we have, if we look at evaporation of water in our own oceans today, we would see that that's a huge crisis. And that 700 million years later, the first single-celled organism was born. As theists, we would argue that there are single-celled organisms, right? We know that. We can see that. And so we wouldn't argue that there aren't single-celled organisms, although, again, as we unclose or we disclose some of the observations that have been happening in science, 700 million years seems perhaps way too long, okay? Especially when we say that those single-celled organisms have transitioned. If that's really the case, first of all, why are they still here? Why wouldn't they have moved on to the next level? Okay, and why do they continue to reproduce? So over time, these organisms then became more complex, eventually forming hard outer shells. And again, we would argue why do we then continue to see these organisms even today? And suddenly multiple kinds appear, all very different and all changing at the exact same rate. Now this is going to, again, from observable science, present a problem. So what do we mean when we talk about kinds? What do you guys think? We're talking about kinds. What is that a reference to?
Species.
Yeah, that's what we're really talking about. You're right, species, okay? So when we look at species then, the theory of evolution says that all of these species are developing at the same rates at the same time, that they're progressing. Now, we know that species are very different, that they reproduce differently, that the number well, for example, descendants, okay? Rabbits have a lot more babies than cows do over time, right? So even the number of generations, that should make us question this idea. Is this really, could this really be true? Could we have some organisms that go through 200 generations before they hit this change, and some organisms that go through 700 generations and then they suddenly hit this change, and they all change at the same time? We know that that seems mathematically impossible. And actually, if you talk to mathematicians, they would confirm that it is mathematically impossible for them all to suddenly change at the same time. Not only change among species, okay, but also if you look within kinds or within species, you can see that there's great differences. For example, are all babies born at the same birth rate, with the same birth rate or the same size? They're not, right? And even if you look at teenagers, you know, we don't all progress at the same rate. Well, it's true, we all have stages that we go through. Those stages happen at very different times. So if we even take it down you know, to a more personal level, we can see that transitions and changes, they vary. They happen at different speeds, and even differently among genders. Teenage boys shoot up at different times than teenage girls do. A lot of times girls shoot up earlier and guys a little bit later. So again, it kind of, it should make us question. Okay. Another evolutionary claim is that natural selection occurs. And you probably, how many of you have heard about natural selection? Is this a theory that you're familiar with? So again, natural selection is that, you know, basically survival of the fittest, that those with the greatest survival skills will pass on their genetics and others will die out. Another term for this then is the war of nature. That nature is at war, and that it is constantly striving for what is, well, that those that are more powerful are going to survive. And that if we look at it that way, if we believe that this is really the case, then what should happen is that nature should be getting better and it should be getting stronger. Okay? And I want you just to think about that for a moment. Just again, has nature gotten stronger? Have natural things gotten better over time? You don't have to answer that question, but think about it. the two then types of natural selection that Darwin, and I'm sure that you are familiar with him, who wrote about evolution, who kind of created this evolutionary theory in his book, The Origin of the Species. He describes two types of evolution. He describes macroevolution and microevolution. And macroevolution is the transition between species. It's saying that a cow eventually became a whale, that an ape eventually became a human being, that a species became another species. And he also then, he based that idea. Now that idea was a historical, was using historical science to come up with that idea, because he based it off of observable science. And observable science, when he studied the finches and he saw that there were changes within the species, and that some of those changes, the changes of the beaks or the colors or those sorts of things happened over time, and it was better for the birds. Now, microevolution, changes within species, is something that we can observe. And as Christians and theists, we can agree with this. This is observable science, right? We can see that over time, species make changes. But what we have never been able to see is that one species can become another species. And that presents a huge, huge problem. So evolutionists or anti-theists, they have not seen that either. And so again, we have to put on a historical lens, our historical glasses, and say, okay, does it make more sense for macroevolution to happen, or does it make more sense for an intelligent design to happen? And that's kind of where we need to move. But before we move there, I want to hear from you guys, and I can see all of you, so I won't stop sharing on my screen. And I'm guessing you can see each other as well. I want to know, how does this idea of macroevolution, not microevolution, but macroevolution, I guess microevolution would play in too. How does it then inform human history? How does it affect human history? Can you think of any times or any events in human history that were directly connected to this idea that within a species you will have a fight for survival? And that, again, macroevolution would say that human beings are just another form of animal that is fighting for that survival. So it might surprise you, but Adolf Hitler was a big Darwinian. Okay, he had read about evolutionary theory and he believed in it wholeheartedly. Knowing that, how does this play into what Hitler does?
It serves as the basis for the Holocaust.
That's right. So he has this belief that races, okay, that specifically the Jewish race is not a superior race. He has this belief that the Aryan race is inherently better and more powerful. And so this justifies his killing of a subhuman, what he would call a subhuman species. He's not the only one. Can you think of anyone else who killed massive numbers of people because they thought these people were inferiors? So you have Joseph Stalin, who lives from 1879 to 1953. Joseph Stalin, he murders, whereas Hitler murders about 6 million Jews, Joseph Stalin murders between 60 million and 100 million people. And again, it's because of his, and he even attests to this idea that these people are weaker and therefore are using resources that are needed for those who should receive them, who are by nature more powerful. So again, when we see evolutionary theory through the lens of evolutionary theory, then that justifies a lot of sin. It justifies a lot of racism. It justifies the killing of innocent people. Are there any arguments that you've ever heard for abortion that seem to fall into this idea, this evolutionary idea that someone is greater than another person.
Like when they talk about like if they were to like have to, or the child would have to go into like foster care or something, that it would be like a lower quality of life, so like they might as well just not have to live it at
Exist.
all, which I guess is kind of what that
Yeah,
would
sure.
be.
Lower quality of life. Anytime we talk about quality of life, we're gearing toward, or we're leaning toward that evolutionary understanding that there is this higher quality of life, that there is this higher state of being than the fact that all life is valuable. The argument that a fetus is not a person because it has not achieved personhood is very much an evolutionary, it has very many ties to evolutionary theory. The fact that because it cannot live on its own, it can't achieve personhood, and personhood has certain measurements, and some of those are self-sustainable. Again, if that's really the measurement, then a baby, a toddler, isn't a human being either, fully human, okay? And so when you begin to have levels of humanity and levels within a species, then you can see that this theory is really playing out in a very negative way. So then what does observable science show us? Because Christians are actually not anti-science. Theists are not anti-science. Intelligent design is not anti-science. And I think those who buy into evolution want to argue that Christianity is anti-science, but actually Christians really, for the most part, support observable science. In fact, I can't think of anything that's observable that Christians would say, oh, no, don't believe that, okay? So what does observable science show us? Well, it actually shows us that the world is quite orderly, that there are certain laws and there are certain orders that happen all the time. So one of those ideas, or those orders, is that like begets like. Okay, so there's this idea that was actually in the 1600s. Francesco Redi, I think that's how you say his name. It's been a long time since I studied him, but he looks at, for a while, people thought that maggots came from meat. Okay, and Francesco Redi does an experiment in Italy, and he says, no, actually, they come from flies. That like begets like. That flies have babies that look like larvae, and that meat cannot spontaneously create life, dead meat, okay? Later, in 1864, Louis Pasteur does another experiment where he tests this theory of spontaneous generation. What he does is he puts water in two different bulbs, and he puts chicken broth in each of them. And he knows that he knows about microorganisms by this time. He knows that things are alive, and he knows that to kill them, he has to heat them up. So what he does is he heats up both of those bowls of water and chicken broth, and they both have swan necks on them. And a swan neck is a tube that comes up and then goes down and up so that nothing can float in, but steam can escape. And so he has swan necks on both of them. And he takes one swan neck off, and he allows that one to be open to the elements, and he keeps the other one with a swan neck on. And guess what happens? What do you think? Is there growth in either of them? There is growth in one of them. Which one has growth? Swan neck or no swan neck?
No swan neck.
That's right. Once he opens it up to the elements, he knows about bacteria, and bacteria gets to feed. And so he proves, again, there is no spontaneous generation. There is no way that something that is not living can create something that is living. Now, evolutionary theory claims that at one time, there was something that was non-living that suddenly became a living entity. And that doesn't make any sense. It doesn't work with observable science. Okay? The next thing that science shows us is that patterns exist. We have seasons, and those seasons are regular, and they don't change order from year to year. The sun always rises in the east and sets in the west. We have symmetry. in fronds, right? Plants, symmetry in animals, symmetry in light and sound waves. Even though that they are different size, their waves continue to be symmetrical. We have patterns. There is a basic order to creation and in the world, okay? We also see that laws exist. Name one law, scientific law, that it doesn't matter if you believe it or not, it's true. What about the law of gravity, right? That things will have gravitational pull on each other. And whether you believe it to be true or not, if you step off a tree branch, you are going to fall. This is a law that doesn't change, right? Other laws, we have the law of motion, that force equals mass times acceleration, and it always does. Even in a vacuum, you've got that law of motion. We have the law of thermodynamics, which says that it takes energy to move matter, and that energy, that over time energy is lost, right? And that's the theory or the law of entropy. And so that's what we're going to remember that, because we're going to talk about entropy in just a little bit. So laws exist, and we as Christians believe that those laws have existed since the beginning of time, that our God is an ordered God and that he created those laws, and they've always been in existence since time began. Now, obviously, pre-day is pre-time. We also know from Gregor Mendel's experiments that genetics pass on traits, and that he studied those pea plants and looked at the figured out that there was a genetic code, but that those genetics are transferred. We also know from observable science that chromosomal changes in genetics aren't positive. They can have no effect on someone. In fact, probably all of us have some chromosomal changes that maybe are abnormal, but we never have seen chromosomal changes that are good, okay, at that genetic level. They never lengthen life, and they often end in death. Not only in death, but sometimes in the inability to reproduce. For example, young men with Down syndrome very rarely can beget a child. They very rarely have the capability of doing so. People with Down syndrome with that extra chromosome don't usually live as long. When we look at the cellular level, when cells decide to go AWOL and they make changes that the rest of the body, a cell is not supposed to make, what is created? Cells that reproduce in the wrong way often create what, Matthew? What?
Cancer.
You're right.
Or
They
any
become,
other disease.
or what?
Just other genetic defects.
Yep, so you either have genetic defects or you have cancer. But again, we never see that is beneficial, that it is long-term going to make you live longer, okay? So that's what we see. We also see in men and women who have an extra chromosome on a gender chromosome, like let's say we have a man with an XXY. Again, reproduction is often hard for that individual. So the idea that a species can become another species not only requires that those genetics be changed, but that they be changed in both a male and a female, so that at the same time, so that they can reproduce and have a new species. And it's not just the genes that have to change, but actually the bodily systems that have to change with them. So when we talk about a cow transitioning to a whale, which is something that evolutionary theory claims, it's not just a genetic transition, but all at once, all of these transitions have to come about. We have to have lungs that used to breathe air but can now breathe in water. We have to have eyes that could see on land that can now see into the depths of the sea. The digestive system has to change. Okay, so again, the possibility mathematically of this happening is impossible. Okay? Okay. So then the next thing is that observable science also shows us that over time, things actually don't get better. They don't get more complex. Things have a tendency to fall apart. And that is the second theory of thermodynamics. That's the law of entropy. It says that energy is lost, and as that happens, atoms become more random, sorry. And actually, so when you have a tight structure, the atoms line up, okay? But as entropy increases, the atoms have more room to be chaotic and rearrange themselves. And again, you see this in the fact that lifespan, okay, if things were actually getting better for the human race, if you look at not just biblical history, but also secular history, you see that lifespan a long time ago was a lot longer. And we continued to decrease our lifespan until modern medicine. Modern medicine then increased that lifespan again. But you know what it didn't do was decrease aging. Aging still happens. We live longer as older people. But we know from older texts that people were having babies much longer than they do without medical help today. In addition, you see this not only in how people change, but you can also see this in nature, right? We have more diseases today. You can actually look back at documents, STDs. I'll just give you that example. Okay, STDs had a rapid increase in the 1500s. They weren't seeing a whole lot of them before that. And since then, STDs and new STDs have come out. Okay, we also have the idea that when you look at things that are part of our culture, when you look at languages, ancient languages are more complex than modern languages. Latin is more complex than English, has more rules. If you look at ancient Greek, it has more rules than what is spoken modernly. So again, if you look scientifically, if you observe what's happened over time, actually things aren't getting, in general, more complex. They seem to be falling apart. And of course, Christians have an answer for that, right? And that answer is sin. My husband likes to, in Bible study, use the idea or the example of a house. When you build a house and you've got it all put together, if you walk away from it and come back 20 to 30 years later, and that's not millions of years, that's 20 to 30 years, is the house going to be in a better condition or in a worse condition? Worse, right? Because things have a natural tendency to fall apart unless we put energy into it. So entropy increases over time. Instead of getting more complex, things devolve. And what does this mean then? It probably means that evolution might not have all the answers. In fact, evolution has to break at least 3 scientific laws in order for it to be true, which seems unscientific, okay? So instead, what we want to look at is intelligent design. And in intelligent design, you see a number of things that are very orderly. If you look at Genesis 1 and you look at day 1 of creation, what do we have? What's created on day 1? And if you know, great. And if you need to look it up, that's okay. But it's verses 1 through 4. What is created on day 1?
Light and darkness, ain't it?
Yeah, that's right. Light and darkness, okay? What about day 2? What's created? There's a separation between the sky and the what? The waters, right? Okay, the water and the air. And then on day 3, we have the creation of land. So notice, first is light and darkness. Second is we have water and air. Third, we have land. Day 4, what does God create? He creates the sun and the moon. Notice that organizational pattern. Day 4, he goes right back to light and darkness, and he creates the sun and the moon and the stars to create that light and darkness. On day 5, things to live in the water, fish.
Birds.
Birds, you're exactly right. Okay. And then on day 6, so day 3 was a creation of land. What does he create on day 6? Things to fill the land. What fills the land?
Animals.
Animals and human beings, right? Okay, so he had already plants on day 3 and day 6. So you can see that there is a distinct order to creation. And if we look at, as far as the biblical account tells us, if we look back, empirical, observable science, we see a whole lot of order in the world. So wouldn't it make sense that that creation was ordered as well? Okay. Of course, we also have a reason for the disorder of today, and that reason would be sin. So if we look at intelligent design, then we see that in the beginning, we look back at humanity, which we see very clearly as the pinnacle of creation, which even if you look at evolutionary theory, most evolutionists would say man is really better than all these animals, right? Because he has all these other capacities that basic animals don't have. Well, as creationists, as people who believe in intelligent design, we would say, yeah, well, again, there is a reason for that. He says, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the heavens and over the livestock and over all the earth. So he creates this beautiful world in days 1 through 6, and he places Adam there, Adam and Eve, and says, look, this gift is for you. And it is a perfectly ordered gift, and it is a gift that gives, that provides for all of mankind's needs, with the exception of God himself, right? But again, that gift is from God himself. And just like he creates male and female, and that reproduction happens among the animal kingdom, of course, he creates a partner for Adam. And the Lord God not only gives Adam a partner, but he also gives Adam and Eve something more than the animals. He breathes the breath of life into them. He gives them a soul. And we see, as creationists, as people who believe in intelligent design, that the intent was for this life, this breath of life, and this physical life, that we might live forever. Okay? God didn't intend or didn't create sin. He created life. So we also see that in the Garden of Eden, God gives more order. He doesn't just provide for Adam and Eve's needs physically, but he also provides for their needs as a community. He establishes family. And we know that every gift that is given in the garden is a good gift. And so family is meant to be a blessing. And family is inherently for life. So I have 3 questions to ask you. So if you guys will unmute yourself and answer the questions, that'd be great. So I want to know, what does a healthy family look like? According to God's design, according to the order that he's given us, what does a healthy family look like?
People who love and take care of each other.
Good. All right. When we look at parents, what does a healthy family look like? We see a reflection of it in the Garden of Eden. We have one man and
one woman.
One woman, right? And we see that what does God say to Adam? What is Adam's role with Eve? What is he supposed to do? He's supposed to take care of her. He's supposed to care for her. We see that, again, the man's role, if it's a healthy marriage, is one that exhibits faithfulness to his wife and service to his wife. Matthew, you said love, and that is definitely the manifestation of that faithfulness and that service, that trust. We have then a wife who is to respond in kind, right? And from them, then their love, the visual manifestation of their love is a child. So how do families then support life? What do you guys think? How do families support life?
They support their kids and don't kill them, I guess.
Okay, that's good, right? They provide a loving home for them where they can raise them. Let's think back to the idea of order. Okay, again, our God is an ordered God. Creation is an ordered creation. So how does this order support the family structure? Or how does this order support life?
Everyone has their own role in the family. If everyone does their role, you have a successful family, a successful life.
Yeah, absolutely. Those roles were established, and you work together, right, for the benefit of the family. We know from a psychological perspective, even apart from faith, that most psychologists will attest to the need for a male and a female in the life of a child. That two parents provide different perspectives and different needs. We see that is true no matter whether you have a son or a daughter. And you have a lot of gifts that you give individually. In general, we see that women are better teachers of empathy and that compassion. Again, not necessarily across the board, but in general. We have women that are the caretakers, wives that are caretakers. In general, the role of a dad is to create independence, to be more physical with their children, to understand risk and the ability to take risk. If you want to grow up and get married, you have to be able to take risk, right? You have to be able to move out of the home. So there are gifts that God gives that support families. What happens when families are broken or don't work like they should? When we think about who suffers most when they're broken, not just from a Christian perspective, but from a psychological one, what do you think psychologists would say?
The child or
Yep.
children.
Yep. Psychologists will say again and again that the child or children will be the individual that suffers most in a broken home. Again, families by nature are ordered so that they support life, the life that comes from them. Okay? And so we're very close to the end. So God designs life for you, and your design actually gives you then purpose. Okay, so you know that that purpose is not only definitely not self-serving, okay, but it does give your life meaning. It does shape your future, and of course purpose is important. So we know that in a society that buys into evolutionary theory, it is very hard to maintain a meaning of life, to buy into a meaning of life. In fact, I think if you work with young people, you'll see that a lot of people young people struggle with what is the meaning, what purpose do I have? Suicide rates among young people are very high. And very often you see in America, not just in America, but worldwide, that this idea, this lack of purpose, this lack of knowledge of what life is meant for and what meaning it has does avail itself to the idea that life is not meaningful and therefore no longer needed. There was a recent poll done in Great Britain, and they polled young people from ages 16 through 29, and they asked them what was the meaning of life. And 89%, almost 9 out of 10 of those students polled, said that they believed that their life had no meaning and no purpose. Okay, now that's a very scary statistic, because when your life ceases to have meaning or purpose, it becomes disposable. And so we have seen an increase in suicide rates. We see this very clearly in abortion rates. We see this in the move toward physician-assisted suicide in countries around the world. Again, when life ceases to have meaning, then it becomes disposable. Okay? So, how can you, as a Christian, and how does this whole idea of evolution versus creation, how can it affect how you interact with others? Again, you have a message that is a beautiful message to share, and that is that you have a purpose because you were purposely designed, and that you were purposely designed for others, not to be self-serving, not for the benefit of yourself, but in response to God's great love, we are designed to serve our neighbor. And this is foundationally located in the fact that we were created by God, that we're redeemed by Jesus, and that we have been called then to faith in Christ himself. And that is a word of hope. So does our belief about the beginning, evolution versus creation, have an effect on life? It absolutely does. If you do have any questions in the future, feel free to, send an email. I'd be happy to answer them and look it up if I need to. You guys are on the front lines. Do your teachers teach evolution? I know you either go to high schools, Lutheran high schools, or colleges. So Lutheran North doesn't teach evolution?
Freshman year, he spent like 20 minutes on it and just kind of over it.
Yeah, I think in general, that's usually the Lutheran approach. Usually just don't teach it. I think it's important to know what evolutionary theory claims. I think it is important to know it so that you have an intellectual argument against it, right? To be able to say, yeah, but what does observable science actually show us? Is that observable? And so if we can't observe it, then we have to look through a lens that we trust. And I think when we look through the intelligent design lens, we have a lot of supports for that lens that are observable. Do you know, is it taught at CUC?
I feel like when the intro science class that I had, I think it was like bio and chemistry. It wasn't really like talked about as a topic. She more of kind of just like hinted at parts of it that you could kind of tell that like that's what she was like meaning to get at, was the idea of evolution. And so, like I would write it down in my notes, but then I would like always add something to the side and be like, well, that's wrong because of this, or like that. So
yeah, I know. I went to Concordia, Nebraska, and I had to take a few science classes, and one of our professors did not believe in the 7-day creation. He believed, he combined evolutionary theory and basically said, if God's in charge, does it really matter? And I would argue that it does really matter. That if we start to say that the 7th-day creation didn't really exist, that a day could be 1,000 or 1,000,000 years, even though the term for day in the Old Testament is always a 24-hour period. If you look back at the Hebrew that's used there, whenever it is used in the Old Testament, it always means 24 hours. And so to say, well, what God really meant in the first 2 books of the Bible, 3 books of the Bible, especially the first book, that what God really meant is that day was, billions of years. I think when you start to question the Word of God, you open up the door to question the Word of God and other scientific issues. For example, could it really be possible that a man could live in the belly of a fish for 3 days? Scientifically, no. Miraculously, yes. And so you can go through the Old Testament and see that some of those we could, if we are doing purely from a scientifical viewpoint, could this be true? Well, it could not be true that a person who was dead for 3 days came back to life. You see how eventually it leads to discrediting the resurrection. So it's a slippery slope, and I think that we as Christians really do need to have a firm foundation and understand why do we argue that it is as the Bible says it is.
Thanks for joining us for today's life topic. Check out Y4Life.org or email Michelle at Y4Life.org to find out how and when you can go live with us at our next Chats for Life session. Or join us next time, right here at Y4Life Podcasts, where youth learn how to be gospel-motivated voices for life.